Well, this past week, I missed my train. Well, actually, it drove right past me and it just didn't stop. Confused, frustrated, annoyed, we started calling the customer service number to try and get some answers. Finally, after talking to several employees, they discovered what had happened. They discovered that our train had stopped. We just hadn't noticed it because our train had been a short train. So it had actually stopped at the beginning of the station. And because this particular station was under renovation, we were in a section at the end that was blocked off. You couldn't see it, meaning you couldn't see the train where it had stopped. So while we were waiting for it inside, it was waiting somewhere else for us to board. And so when we eventually saw it driving towards us, we thought it was arriving to pick us up, but it was actually accelerating to the next station, having thought it had picked up all the passengers at the station. Defeated is a good word to describe how I felt in the moment. Frustrated that through no fault of my own, I would now need to wait another hour for the next train. Have you ever been in that scenario? Feeling defeated? Knowing that for whatever reason, you would now have to endure a season of waiting, of difficulty, of pain? There's a fascinating story of defeat in the Bible about a guy named Habakkuk. He was a prophet, and his job was to communicate with God on behalf of the people. God would send messages to his people through the prophet, messages of encouragement, messages of caution, and messages of correction. And the prophet's role was to be a liaison between God and his people. They would help the people of God understand what God was asking them to do. And they would also bring the requests of the people to God. Now, during the time that Habakkuk was the prophet, God's people had grown very corrupt, very disobedient. In fact, they refused to obey any of the requests that God had made of them. Instead, they acted like spoiled children who insisted that their parents buy them cell phones only to smash them and then demand a new phone the next day. Over and over, the people of God would treat God like their genie. They'd ignore him, they'd disregard his instructions, and they would only pause their destructive behaviors when they needed him. And when they needed him, they would demand that Habakkuk the prophet go to God on their behalf. Now, it was at this time that there was a group named the Babylonians who were increasing in power over the whole area. The Babylonians had overtaken many other cities, and God's people were nervous that their community would be next. And so they insisted that the prophet Habakkuk go to God and demand that he protect them and not allow any harm to come to them. Well, Habakkuk was grieved about the whole situation. He was angry about the disobedience towards God that the people had, but he was also worried about the very likely reality that the Babylonians could overtake them. So he agreed to go and speak to God on their behalf. And so Habakkuk asks God for two things. First, he pleads with God to draw the people back to obedience. And next, Habakkuk asks God to protect them from the Babylonians. And you'd expect God to agree, right? To help his people return back to obedience and save them from their defeat. But instead, God chooses to do something else. See, God tells Habakkuk, it's going to be very difficult for you to hear what I'm about to say. So I need you to brace yourself. Prepare yourself, Habakkuk. And then God goes on to say, be assured, I hear my people's cries. I know that they want me to rescue them. But instead of rescuing them at this time, I am going to allow the Babylonians to rise up against my people and overtake them. I'm going to use the situation to discipline them so they will return back to obedience. It's hard to understand why a loving God would allow his people to be defeated by an evil nation, isn't it? It doesn't sound like that warm, fuzzy God we're all comfortable with. But there's something in the Bible that helps us understand what God is doing here. In Hebrews 12, verse 6, it says, God disciplines those who he loves. See, God calls himself a parent, our parent. And one of the main jobs of a parent is to discipline and guide their children. It's not a fun job. It's certainly not glamorous. It's not warm and fuzzy. It doesn't feel good to ground your children from things that they love to teach them an important lesson. But it is necessary. Because children who do not understand rules and boundaries will become destructive adults with no rules and boundaries. The truth is that sometimes bad things happen because we make bad choices. For example, choose to speed on the highway, receive a speeding ticket. Choose to cheat on your significant other, find yourself single. Choose to lie to your boss, find yourself without a job. Choose to plagiarize on a paper, find yourself kicked out of school. Unfortunately, consequences are a natural reaction to our bad choices. And God loves us enough to allow us to live with the consequences of our bad choices because He knows that they can help us return to obedience. Because the role of discipline is always to help open our eyes to see where our destructive behavior is leading and then give us the opportunity to return to obedience. But it's always our choice. We can continue to live in our destructive ways, or we can own up to our bad choices and stop our destructive ways. And if that's you today, if you're living through a difficult season because of some bad choices that you have made, there's a simple step to help you turn it around. Admit it. Admit it to God, and then admit it to those who you have harmed through your choices. And this is how we experience great joy, even in seasons of defeat, by recognizing that God disciplines us because He loves us, and then by admitting to God that we've messed up and asking Him to help us stop our destructive behaviors so that we can return to obedience.